A School of Her Own by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 11. A Winter with a Vengeance. Winter arrived in earnest after the Christmas holidays. It seemed that the snow never stopped falling, sometimes in flurries, sometimes in blizzard-sized flakes. I was thankful for the promised ride to school in the sleigh. For many days the drifts were so deep that walking would not have been possible. The smaller children, who had no one to bring them, were forced to stay at home. In spite of what I considered an overabundance, the snow didn't lose its fascination for the children. They bundled up at recess times and found ways to enjoy it. The few times that I was persuaded to join them, I agreed that it was great fun. The boys stamped out a large circle with a cross in the middle to play fox and geese. Before long, the track was so slippery that the children were on the ground more than they were running. Both the boys and girls enjoyed making angels in the new drifts. They would fall back in the snow, then swing their arms and legs to make wings and a skirt. Help was needed to get up so that the angel was not marred by handprints. Teddy Sawyer had definite ideas about angels. "I'm not putting any dress on mine," he declared. "Are all the angels in the Bible ladies?"
"I'm sure they aren't," I said. "Gabriel is a man, and the angels who visited Abraham and Sarah were men." "Who were some of the lady angels?" Julianne wanted to know. "I'm not at all sure about that," I confessed. "I'll have to do some studying about angels. I do know that the Bible says he giveth his angels charge over you to keep you in all your ways. That's the most important thing."
"Well, I know I don't want to be one if I have to wear a dress," Teddy muttered. "I'd feel silly flying around in a skirt." "You'd look pretty foolish, too," Edward snickered. "Besides, you don't have to worry none about being an angel." He ducked as Teddy swung at him with both fists, and I quickly stepped in to separate them.
"Why don't you two boys build a big fort and have a snowball fight?" I suggested. "Just remember, no ice balls and no stones in your ammunition."
The fort took the rest of the afternoon recess to construct, and the air was filled with flying missiles whenever the children were outside. All but the most timid entered the fray, and no one suffered more than cold hands and wet feet. More than winter weather descended with a vengeance during the month of January. The trouble began when Abe arrived at school one morning with his arm in a crudely designed sling.
"Oh, Abe, did you break your arm? Did you go to a doctor to have it set?"
"No, ma'am. Pa says it'll heal all right without no doctor."
"How did it happen? Did you fall?"
"No, ma'am."
I was determined to find out what had caused his injury.
"Abe, did your father break your arm?" I asked.
Abe hesitated.
"Yes'm, but he didn't mean to. He yanked me harder than he thought."
I was appalled. That the man had not only broken his son's arm, but refused to get medical treatment for him was beyond my understanding. I said nothing more to Abe, but the longer I thought about the situation, the angrier I became. I was still turning it over in my mind as we ate supper that evening. "Mabel, you aren't eating much tonight. Are you feeling all right?" Mrs. Williams was concerned.
"I feel fine," I replied. "I'm a little upset is all. Abe came to school today with a broken arm."
"That's too bad," Len said. "But it seems as though most boys break a bone or two before they grow up. Don't worry, it will heal in no time."
"Yes, but this is—"
I stopped. I couldn't tell these people about Mr. Lawton. If Len was indeed interested in Elizabeth, they wouldn't want to hear it. Or if the information caused Mr. Williams to approach Cy Lawton, I would be in trouble. Maybe it just wasn't my business at all.
"I can see why you're upset," Alice said. "You don't like to see one of your children hurt, even if he is a rough boy."
I looked at her gratefully and nodded. Nothing more was said about the matter, and I tried to take part in the conversation for the rest of the meal. But by the time I was ready for bed, I had decided that this was my business after all. I determined to go and talk to Mrs. Lawton. The next day dragged by slowly, and the fact that another storm appeared to be fathering prompted me to dismiss the children early. In spite of the darkened sky, I turned my steps toward the Lawtons' farm. I was not prepared for the person who met me at the kitchen door. Mrs. Lawton was a tall, angular woman, hollow-cheeked and tired-looking. Her clothes were clean, but terribly in need of repair. She carried a baby in her arms and was followed by a small girl about 2 years old. She looked both surprised and embarrassed at the sight of me, and I had a momentary feeling of regret that I had not given her warning of my visit. "You'd be Miss O'Dell, wouldn't you?" she said. "Come in." I followed her into the crowded kitchen and sat down in the chair she indicated. "Carrie, you take that baby back and put her to sleep. Julianne and Nancy, go play with Ruthie in your room." When the children had left, Mrs. Lawton turned her attention to me. "I can see why my husband spends so much time hanging around the school. You're a pretty little thing, especially compared to what he has at home." I could feel the blood draining from my face.
"Oh no, Mr. Lawton doesn't come over to the school to see me," I protested.
"What for, then?"
"Why, I suppose he comes by to check up on Abe."
Mrs. Lawton shook her head.
"He don't care none about Abe."
"Well, I do," I exploded. "And I think the way his father treats him is nothing short of criminal. How can you stand by and allow it?"
Her face took on a tortured look.
"I can't help it," she said. "Si says Abe's not my boy and I'm not responsible for him. He'll raise him the way he sees fit."
She looked apprehensively toward the door.
"He'll be right angry if he knows you interfered. He'll think we told you. Could we say you come about the girls' schoolwork if he was to come in?"
"The girls are doing well," I said. "Nancy is reading in the primer and Julie Ann has improved her arithmetic. You can say I talked about the girls. But I am concerned about Abe, Mrs. Lawton. Isn't there anything I can do?"
She shook her head and motioned me to silence as we heard feet stomping on the porch. The door opened and a blast of icy wind swept in behind Si Lawton. He slammed the door shut.
"You'll have to do the milking tonight,"
he said to his wife.
"Abe can't do much with one hand."
She stood obediently and reached for a heavy sweater and a shawl. Mr. Lawton looked over at me.
"As for you, I guess I know what you're here for. This isn't the time to discuss it. Get your things on, I'll take you home."
I wanted to say,
"I'm not your wife, that you can order me around,"
but I realized that it would not be the better part of wisdom to do so. There was no one here who would keep Si Lawton from knocking me around as he did his son. Nevertheless, there was no power on earth that would make me accept his offer to take me home.
"I arrived by myself, and I'll go back the same way, thank you."
He eyed me carefully as I wrapped my scarf around my neck and pulled on my heavy mittens. I picked up my books and started for the door. For a moment, I thought he was not going to let me out, but then he stepped back.
"Suit yourself, my lady, but don't tell the righteous Williams family that I didn't warn you."
"Warn me about what?"
I thought as Mr. Lawton pulled open the door. Then I stepped out on the porch and saw at once that the storm had turned into a blizzard. The snow felt like ice being driven sideways. There was no visible path ahead of me, and I knew the foolishness of trying to get back to the road over unfamiliar territory. I heard the door close behind me and considered the possibility of joining Mrs. Lawton in the barn, but the thought of being snowed in with this family and that dreadful man was too much. I had to try to get home, no matter what the odds were against me. It was completely dark, although I knew it couldn't be 5 o'clock yet, and by the time I had moved 10 paces from the steps, the house was no longer visible. I struck off in the direction I was sure I had come, and after putting the ends of my scarf around my face, I lowered my head and charged into the storm. I couldn't move very fast. The wind held me back, and the snow drifted in front of me as I watched. Surely there would be some sign of a path made by everyone who had gone in and out today. I had only been in the house 20 minutes, but I could see nothing. I recalled the rope that Pa stretched between the house and the barn during a storm. I had lived long enough in the country to know that one's chances of survival in a blizzard like this were slim indeed. I had made a mistake. I would swallow my pride and my fear, and go back to the Lawtons for shelter. I turned around, but realized with a sinking heart that whatever lay behind me looked exactly like what lay ahead. I had no way of knowing whether I had turned a quarter, a half, or the whole way around. There was no choice but to keep going, regardless of where I was headed. As I stumbled slowly through the snow, I prayed,
Lord, I'm sorry I was so impetuous. I should have made sure that this was the thing you wanted me to do in the first place. I didn't accomplish anything by facing Mrs. Lawton, and now if I die out here in the snow, it will just make things harder for my folks and the Williamses and Len. Ma always said my pride would be my downfall, and she was right. Why didn't I tell Len about all of this and get his advice? What shall I do now, Lord?
By this time I had begun to cry, but when I discovered that my tears were freezing on my eyelashes and face, I forced myself to stop. I was cold enough already without producing more ice to carry around. I had no idea how far I had gone, nor how much time had passed when I sank into snow above my waist. Even when I dropped my books, I couldn't scramble out. The harder I tried to climb, the deeper I sank. Breathless, I stopped fighting the snow.
At least, I thought, it's warm down here. I've heard of people keeping warm in snow caves. Maybe I'm all right. I'll rest a few minutes and then try again.
My next conscious thought was that I ached. My hands, feet, and face were stinging as though I were being pelted with needles. I opened my eyes. Alice and Mrs. Williams were rubbing me briskly. Mr. Williams and Len looked down at me anxiously. "She's awake! Thank you, Lord," said Mr. Williams. "Get some warm broth, Alice," Mrs. Williams directed. "We'll have you warmed up in no time, Mabel. You just lie still until the circulation comes back. A good hot bath and a warm bed is what you need." No one reprimanded me for being out in the storm, nor even asked where I had been. As I sipped the broth, Len told me how he had found me. "I went to school to get you at the regular time, because the storm had already begun," he said. "When I found you weren't there, I remembered how upset you were about Abe. I was pretty sure that's where you had gone. I had the lantern and watched carefully along the road. When I was almost there, I saw one of your books, and I figured if the book was there, you were too. So I got out and dug until I found you. I thank the Lord that I got there in time, Mabel. You weren't far from the Lawtons' home, but they wouldn't have come out looking if they weren't expecting you. They didn't know you were coming, did they?" I shook my head.
I wasn't going to their house. I was on my way back home.
Len's face grew dark with anger. "You mean you had been at the house and they let you leave in that storm?"
"I insisted," I said. "I couldn't stay there."
"Cy knew you didn't have a chance of getting home by yourself," Len said. "Even someone who's lived here all his life could get lost in that blizzard. He's going to hear about this." I didn't have the strength to protest, but I knew that my behavior would cause trouble in the community. Perhaps I could think of some way to get things straightened out before the weather cleared. End of chapter 11.